Hi, everybody, and welcome to the webinar on the impact of the meat and dairy industry on climate change and the benefits of plant-based diet. With me, I have two experts from ProVeg International. They're going to give you a quick explanation on the benefits of a pro-plant diet. But first of all, I want to make sure that you realize that this webinar is part of the competition that Climate Tracker has set up recently, in which you can win a spot to the Biodiversity Cup in Egypt in November this year. All you need to do is follow the link descriptions down below in this video to join the competition. And you can use any information that the two experts will give in this webinar for your article. I'd like to introduce Daniel Brown from ProVeg International. He's the head of research and science. And Ruchir, head of campaigning of ProVeg International. Maybe you can shortly introduce yourself.
Oh God, that's not you. Okay, so I'm Ruchir, the head of campaigning for ProVeg International, which means that I work with the media, with the public, and with policymakers to show them the benefits of a more plant-based future economy and society.
Yes, and I'm Daniel, head of research. Doing most of the background research we need for our daily work, for media outreach, for campaigning, and so on. I'm also trying to connect with scientists around the globe to look into the most urgent problems we have to work on. That's what we are doing.
That sounds perfect. It sounds very important and very impressive. I'm looking forward, and I think all our viewers are looking forward to hear about what ProVeg exactly does and what your work entails. So if you are ready, it would be great if you can share your presentation with us. And viewers, everybody who is watching live can ask questions in the box on the right, and we'll ask them after the presentation.
First, let's share our screen then.
Do you want to have some first words on ProVeg in general?
Oh, we could. Yeah, so to start off, just to tell you a bit about ProVeg International. We're an international food awareness organization who exists across 6 countries at the moment. So Germany, Poland, Spain, the Netherlands, the UK, and South Africa. And we work towards a world where people choose delicious food that's good for them, good for the animals, and good for the planet. And we're doing this with our long-term mission, which is to reduce the consumption of animal products by 50% by the year 2040.
Yeah, great.
So 50% by the year 2040.
Yes.
Okay, great.
All right, so how about we get our presentation started? So I'll hand it over to Daniel to start things off.
Yes, so this presentation is on the impact of meat and dairy on our climate, and maybe even a bit more not only on climate change, but also environmental impacts of our food choices as a whole. Very important, as you probably already heard, we have to face a lot of environmental problems besides climate change, of course, and our food choices play a very important role in all those problems. And just to have a very short overview on this, what's going on, for example, only recently the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, which also one reason for this is farm pollution. We have to face the 6th mass extinction for biodiversity, and which is a huge problem. Only just some little pictures from the news. Overexploitation in agriculture are seen as one of the main causes for biodiversity loss. And to be a bit more regional, for example, in Germany, only recently in all the water bodies and seas and rivers, resistant strains of bacteria were found that can be dangerous for people. And also Germany was sued by the EU because of high nitrate pollution in groundwater, which pollutes groundwater, drinking water, and might be a risk for human health as well.
And much of this is related to industrialization of animal agriculture,
Yes.
factory farming, intensive farming, with hormones, with chemical fertilizers, with antibiotic overuse.
Yes. So climate change is probably one of the most urgent problems today we have to face, putting at risk global food security, water availability, biodiversity, and also living conditions of millions of peoples. Some of the most urgent impacts, for example, is that only this year it was found out that the Gulf Stream current is at its weakest point during 1,600 years. Also, just this month, the new report on food security in the world was published, stating that world hunger has increased and reached 820 million people again. So 1 in 9 people. I'm back. And this year's report is also on building climate resilience. And there was one nice sentence. New evidence in this year's report highlights that beside conflicts, climate variability and extremes are also a key force behind the recent rise in global hunger. They are also one of the leading causes of severe food crisis. And there's also another social justice topic, the one of climate migrants, which will probably rise dramatically during the next years while water levels are rising and climate change becomes bigger. There are food losses and agricultural
droughts
losses.
become more common. Extreme weather events become more common. We've seen droughts across the global north and south, from Australia to Syria, and it causes socioeconomic instability, no matter how rich or poor or stable the country was before.
Exactly. And so for a long time, the main focus of climate change mitigation was on industry, energy, transport. So looking into or financing into renewable energies, looking how electrical cars might work. And that even though that human consumption of animal products is a major driver of climate change. And there's a lack on this at the moment, a lack of understanding and awareness on the impacts of our food choices. And just a few examples. It is estimated that about 30% of all greenhouse gas emissions originate from the global food system. So agriculture and all the processes after agriculture that have to do with food. As we know from the IPCC, about 25%, okay, it's 24, but about 25% of greenhouse gas emissions originate from global agriculture. And also, we know that a figure from the Food Organization of the United Nations that livestock farming accounts for about 14.5% of all anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, which is more than the entire transport sector.
So more than every car, bus, truck, plane, or ship in the world. And we spend so much time analyzing, how to make this transition to a fossil-free transport system possible, or how to transition towards renewable energy, or move away from coal and gas and oil. But similarly, we should be looking at how to create a sustainable form of agriculture in the coming decades.
Exactly. And for example, another study from other institutes that found out that the top 20 meat companies emit more than the whole of Germany or the whole of Canada or Australia. So you can see that there is a large impact on climate, even due to animal consumption, even larger than that of a country like Germany, that is probably one of the biggest meat producer in the world.
And it's the biggest polluter in all of Europe.
I think in all of Europe,
yes.
So this is one very important thing regarding climate change, but there are also more impacts on the environment. As more and more land is required, for example, to feed livestock. And it is also estimated that about 80% of all agricultural land is dedicated to livestock production. And this land needs to feed those animals, to feed those animals. All those there have to be natural habitats, have to be cleared. So most of deforestation occurs in tropical regions with a high biodiversity. And It is, for example, estimated that about 80% of all deforested areas in the Amazon rainforest has been converted to pastures, and that the remaining 20% are more or less used for growing feed crops such as soybeans. And there are even figures that about 91% of all deforested areas since the 1970s have been used for some kind of livestock feeding, grazing.
In the Amazon, yes.
Yeah, in the Amazon. And just a little outlook to the chapter of solution, not yet. If we would reduce, for example, the consumption of animals, the deforestation rate would decrease by about 47 to 55%. And as we talk about deforestation and biodiversity, we are currently living in in an era of the sixth mass extinction. So there are dying so many animals and species are threatened by extinction, as, for example, in the times the dinosaurs went extinct. So there was one study in Nature, for example, that looked into threatened and nearly threatened species, and they found out that the highest threat comes from overexploitation and agriculture. And there was another recent study that found out that if we just look at mammals, 60% of all mammals are livestock at the moment. 36 of all mammals or of mammal biomass are humans, and only 4% are wild animals. This is also quite shocking because the humans only make up a small proportion of all life on planet, but nonetheless they are responsible for the loss of about 83% of mammals and about half of all plants. Yes. And there it is also important to understand even more why this is happening. So we have to understand the more underlying cause of climate change, which is, for example, animal consumption. So today the world is shifting more and more towards animal consumption, which means that the proportion of meat, milk, and eggs in our diets is steadily increasing on a global scale, while it is mostly stagnating in other regions. I have a little graph here which shows the global meat production around the globe in different regions. And we can see, for example, that in the European Union, it nearly doubled since the early 60s or mid of the 60s, but since 1990, it is more or less stagnating. Same with Northern America, while in regions such as Eastern Asia, there's a rapid increase of meat production. So we can see, or we can observe a spread of the more Western style diet, and those dietary patterns become more and more, or get a more and more Western touch. And this change in eating habits is mostly due to social transformation processes, for example, in the course of urbanization, economic development, and globalization of the food system, so that more traditional eating patterns are more and more replaced by an urban industrial style of eating. And if we also look at this graph, we can see that that meat production is now 4 times as high as it was in the 60s or mid 60s. And if we go back to 1960, it's even about 5 times as high. We can also look into what kind of animals. Oh, yeah, another point is that the amount of animal or amount of meat production, for example, is now 4 times as high, but in the same time, world population only doubled more or less from 1965 to 2017. We can also have a look into the different species that are used for human consumption, which is mostly pig, chicken, and cattle. And while with cattle, there's also more or less a little stagnation, there's a huge rise in the consumption of pigs and chickens. And then we can also have a look, and this also, when we not talk about tons, we can also see that this amounts to about 70 billion animals that are slaughtered each year. So in general, you could say that for every person on Earth, there are 10 animals per year. And just another graphic for global animal consumption. This, each country depicts the total amount of meat consumed by its population per year. So the borders are a bit stretched or not.
Yes, to represent the amount.
Yes. So the color represents the per capita consumption in each country, and you can see that in the northern hemisphere, like North America, or in the European Union and European countries, meat consumption is really high it's really high. While, for example, countries like Asian countries, they have a high total consumption of animals due to the large population, of course, but they still have a lower
average rate per person.
Yes.
For example, Japan here, which is quite light, it's in the 26 to 50 kilos of meat consumption per person per year. But because of its population, over 100 million, that scales to make it quite a large number.
Exactly. So we can see if the consumption of meat and other animal products increases at current rates, the global greenhouse gas emissions from animal agriculture would further rise dramatically till 2050, and it would put at risk or even make it impossible to reach the 2-degree and 1.5-degree goals from the Paris Agreement. As you can see in this graph, it's also from grain, that, for example, in a business as usual scenario, when all other sectors go down with their emissions, but meat production and consumption further increases, this would mean that by 2050, already the whole livestock agriculture would make up 80% of the whole emissions on the globe. So the problem we are facing, there are a lot of problems, of course. Those were just the environmental topics, but animal consumption also touches more fields like health topics, the animals themselves, social justice topics, and more.
Yeah, for example, climate justice is a demand of many governments and activists in the global south. And it is very unfair that subsidies towards industrialized agriculture, factory farming, intensive agriculture in North America or Western Europe or Australia and New Zealand cause such a massive amount of climate-causing emissions of methane. And instead of tackling these, at many climate negotiations, developing countries are told, oh, you can't build power plants and your people live in darkness because we in the West don't want to even slightly reduce our overconsumption. So that brings us to the solutions. Now, having seen the extent of this problem and the various causes of it, especially in terms of meat production consumption, what can we do about it? So as individuals, eating a plant-based diet is a very effective way to cut your food-related carbon footprint in half. And in developed countries in the global north, for example, in the EU, reducing the consumption of animal products by 50% would achieve a 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. Across the whole world, it would be even more dramatic.
Yeah, for example, do you want? Sorry.
That's all right. So in the US, according to the latest research, if everyone replaced just one thing in their diet, if they replaced beef with the same amount of proteins and calories from beans, that single change would be enough for the US to meet up to 74% of its Paris climate goals for 2020. That's 1.5 years from now. Then various studies from scientists at Oxford and Harvard have come out saying the same, that as an individual, if you want to reduce your impact on the earth and on climate change, then avoiding meat and dairy is the most impactful way. Similarly, if our population reaches 10 billion in this century, in order to ensure that good food, healthy food, is accessible and affordable for everyone, it's very important to invest in plant-based proteins, which are the cheapest and most sustainable way of delivering protein to people. Then in terms of the global food emissions, we could reach almost 70% reductions by transitioning away from heavy meat consumption. Now, in terms of policy, so on one hand, there's steps that you can do as an individual, but there's also policies that governments can take up. So the UN came out last year before COP with a statement saying that when it comes to food, the highest carbon footprint comes from meat. Therefore, eating vegetarian food on a regular basis reduces greenhouse gas emissions and is a key factor in helping to achieve the objectives of the Paris Climate Change Agreement. Now, there's a wide range of policies and strategies that have come up around the world to encourage this sort of change. One of these is smarter pricing models. Anything that has a negative environmental externality, be it red meat, coal, diesel, should have the damage that it causes to the environment or to people's health reflected in the final price. Otherwise, we pay for it anyway. We pay for it with higher health insurance. We pay for it with a warming planet and insecurity, food insecurity. Similarly, another element of pricing is when it comes to processed meat, the World Health Organization considers it an equal health risk as tobacco or alcohol. Now, governments don't subsidize industrial production of tobacco and alcohol. They tax it in order to reduce consumption for social benefit. Similarly, some countries have proposed the same for factory farming for meat production. Then, apart from taxes, you could also have positive incentives, so smart agricultural subsidies that governments can create a pull factor towards a more plant-based agricultural economy through better products, better processes. And this can also be accelerated by investment in new technologies for plant-based protein. Then a nudge factor we've seen in some countries is providing more catering options in public institutions, in schools, in hospitals, even in prisons. Portugal is a good example of this, where they've made it mandatory by law to always have a plant-based option, a vegetarian or vegan option, which not only makes it more accessible to the public, but it's also not about taking something away. The government's not taking meat away from your plate. It's giving you more options. It's giving you more choice, and it's generating better opportunities for farmers, training opportunities for chefs, and is generally quite well received. Then technologically, we've seen major companies come up with innovations like lab-grown meat, clean meat as it's called, or plant-based meat, and ensuring that the regulatory structures don't hinder this progress is important. And addressing the supply side issue of encouraging food companies to invest in this as the future. So I can show you some best practices from around the world. So a lot of those were proposed. Some of them are coming into place now. France, for example, earlier this year has launched a big investment, a state-run investment into intelligence proteins. It wants to achieve global leadership within the next 12 years when it comes to innovative protein solutions. So they're investing in plant-based protein, pea protein, lentils in a big way. China, which you do not generally associate with leadership on issues like this, have adjusted their diet guidelines and are recommending a 50% reduction even from the current level of meat consumption in their country. And in order to make this possible, they have partnered with the leading food technology companies from around the world to transfer that technology and invest it in China, so that as they lift people out of poverty, as people become richer, and it becomes aspirational to drive a big car or to eat lots of meat because that's what they've seen rich people do, or that's what they've seen Western lifestyles to be. If they want to do that, they should drive an electric car and they should eat sustainable plant-based proteins or lab-grown meat. Then the Netherlands has been doing the same in Europe. There are think tanks that have done research into whether a meat tax would cause public concern or upset, and they said that no. In fact, most people would support it if it was proposed. And there was one other thing that's not over here. That there are now meat companies as well that are showing leadership on this without any nudge from the government at all. So one of the biggest meat companies in the world, their CEO has said that for them, the future of their industry is to be more sustainable, because being more sustainable is more profitable. And they have invested $150 million into plant-based alternatives to meat, into lab-grown meat. And their CEO said that at the end of the day, we are not a meat company, we're a food company, we're a protein company. And if people want food, if people want protein, it can come from an animal, it can come from plants. The point is, it's our job to deliver that to people. And an example that we often use when talking to the industry is that of Kodak. That Kodak thought that it dominated photography for decades by focusing on chemicals as a chemicals company. But when you look at it from the perspective of the consumer, they didn't think of Kodak as a chemicals company, they thought of it as a memories company. And as soon as digital cameras came along, consumers adopted that because it was a better product. Similarly, if there's more sustainable products that consumers respond well to, companies should innovate for their own benefit, not just for the planet or the animals. And that's a good push factor as well, that when companies themselves want to do it, when governments themselves want to do it, and consumers themselves want this transition, it creates momentum, just like it did with LED bulbs or with solar power and now with electric cars. So now we can open it up to your questions.
Wow, that was a really useful presentation. Loads of facts, loads of numbers, but also a lot of useful journalistic research that you showed. I think that could be very useful for the people watching here. I got loads of questions from people watching via Twitter and Facebook as well. Lily from Malaysia, for example, asked, you talked a lot about all the different international elements. Do you think that all countries need to go plant-based? And will that be good for developing economies if you go to a plant-based diet, or if you have policies in place? That's Lily's question.
So it depends on the consumption levels within these countries. So at the moment, the problem of overconsumption is mostly a problem in the global north, where countries like Australia or the US have an average consumption. An Australian person eats on average 100 kilos of red meat per year. That is extraordinarily high. And when you compare this to, for example, Tunisia or Malaysia, where the average is 10 kilos to 25 kilos per year, in fact, these countries are a good example for the West to reduce their consumption. I think the challenge for the Global South is not necessarily to reduce meat consumption, although it would be good for sustainability, but the real challenge is to maintain low consumption and not be pressured by the marketing or lobbying of major meat companies and dairy companies into exponential growth. If you look at the global north, if you look at the developed world, 60 years ago, people had the same consumption patterns as the global south today. People ate meat once a week or twice a week or on special occasions because it was expensive, because it was not created through heavy subsidization or industrialized agriculture. And if that can be reversed, that would have a big impact in our mission, for example, as ProVeg, to reduce meat consumption or animal product consumption by 50% by 2040. Although every step helps. So if Malaysians want to move in a more plant-based direction, that is a great opportunity for Malaysia or any other country in the global south to demonstrate leadership to the rest of the world. And we've seen that from, for example, Morocco has shown leadership on solar power. I would love to see a developing country take the lead on showing leadership on this.
Wow, great answer. I don't think we expected such an elaborate, perfect answer. Next question from Sasa from Croatia. You talked a lot about industrial the effects of industrial farming. Is there a future for localized biological farming ahead?
Ooh. Yeah, probably. I mean, there are a lot of alternatives to the industrialized farming, and I think I have showed one study that showed that even with organic farming, which is not the most probably effective way in terms of output sometimes, but even then you could feed nearly all the people that we have on the planet right now. And there's also there's a lot of research on alternatives to those intensive systems. Yes. Like it's still a little niche topic, but there's also a lot of thinking around, for example, vegan organic farming, which is a way of farming without animals, only with, for example, compost with humus, earth, and terra preta, I think. And those ways of farming are even good for building the soil up, for the carbon sink, or for the soil as a carbon sink, because you can, for example, also use all the grasslands you have. You could mow them and use all those organic matter to compost it and to then fertilize fields, just as an example.
And another thing when it comes to organic agriculture versus industrial agriculture, in theory is supposed to be efficient, but is in practice very inefficient, because there's a huge amount of food waste. According to the UN, if food waste was a country, it would be the third biggest polluter in the world. And also the fact that a lot of the corn, a lot of the soy that are grown around the world, about 80 or 90% of those crops are not fed to humans. They are fed to animals in factory farms. Now that means a lot of this is overproduction and wasteful, that those farms, even if they had a lower crop yield with organic agriculture, would still be enough to feed the world if you eliminated these wasteful processes. That to create 1 kilogram of protein in an animal, it takes about 20 kilos of grains. And that's where the inefficiencies come in. So organic agriculture, according to the scientific community, can feed up to 10 billion people for the rest of the century.
Okay, well, I have 2 more questions, and then for anybody who is still asking questions and we don't have time to answer them, please keep asking them, and we'll follow up over writing as well. That would be great. The next question is from Marek. He's asking, okay, with this webinar and with the journalistic competition that ClimateVeg has sent out, we can win a spot to the UN Biodiversity Summit in Egypt, which is coming up this November. You spoke a bit about deforestation and biodiversity as well. How do you, what are your expectations from a high-level event like a UN Biodiversity Summit in terms of pushing forwards new policies and practices in the international community regarding meat consumption?
Can you say it again, please, the question?
So the question would be the UN Biodiversity Summit, which is coming up in November, which is like a version of the UN Climate Summit, let's say. What would your expectations be, or what would, in an ideal case, happen in this type of summit that would push forward international policies on meat consumption?
Well, biodiversity is also a very, very urgent topic. I don't know if you know about the planetary boundaries, for example. Biodiversity loss is a huge threat because, of course, biodiversity also enables us to find new plant species, for example, for curing diseases, plant species we don't even know yet. So, of course, it would be nice if they would intervene when it comes to biodiversity loss, because it's a topic that
is biodiversity in itself often addressed when we're talking about meat consumption or industrial meat?
I think when we talk about meat consumption, we mainly talk about land use. We mainly talk about climate change and deforestation, and then what comes after deforestation, the biodiversity loss. It's a topic that's mostly not talking or not so much spoken about, even though, as I have said, that there is a sixth mass extinction. We are losing a lot of species. It's a huge problem around the globe, and I hope they will address this topic. But it's still hard to tell what they want to achieve and how to stop this development, because we also have, for example, to intervene when it comes to agriculture, because it is one of the largest land users around the globe, and deforestation is mostly for feedstock and for livestock. So when they talk about biodiversity, they also should talk about our food choices.
Yes, one of the challenges that we face when it comes to multilateral organizations like the UN is that the UN is not a single entity. At the end of the day, it's a coming together of member states and the governments of these member states, and they all have their own agendas. And it generally doesn't matter which party or which part of the political spectrum these governments are from, because many conservative parties have deep links with agricultural business. Many leftist progressive parties married to the unions or farmers groups. And so it's very difficult for them to challenge that internationally and then go back to their countries and be scared of losing an election because they've upset their core constituencies. So what we, in many cases find to be effective is to affect a change among those influences. If governments listen to their voters or to the unions or to the companies themselves, then it's key to convince these people. It's key to convince companies that they should want to move into a plant-based future. It's key to show farmers that if they switch to organic agriculture, they will have better prospects. And to show to consumers that a plant-based future is a healthier future for their families, for themselves, and for the planet. And by turning the neck, you turn the head, as we say.
Yeah, that's a really good saying. And that actually brings me to the last question, which relates very much to this question from Dorka, who's asking, the IPCC special report on 1.5 is coming out very soon, which hopefully will create a lot of momentum and scientific agreement towards UN Climate Summit. Do you see any hopes of meat being a part of this IPCC report, and could that push this issue forward as well in climate discussions internationally and nationally?
You want to, let's introduce you to...
Oh, hello there.
This is Nico. He's our campaign manager for climate change advocacy.
Yeah, So I was thinking a bit already about the IPCC report 1.51. So what's already in there in the first draft, it's definitely not enough what they mentioned there. So they have a paragraph about food consumption, and it's they suggest really, I don't know, not really concretely. They talk about changing lifestyles. Something, I don't know, where you think, okay, what do you mean changing lifestyle? How should a government address this? Like, how should you work on changing lifestyle? What is that? So this is like a really short paragraph, like mentioning something with lifestyles. So, and this is of course definitely not enough. So what we would like to see in there is really concretely, why don't you mention reducing meat consumption? This is so clear, and everybody knows about this problem, and we definitely need to, if we, like in the report, it's mentioned like concretely shifting away from fossil fuels and like having all these concrete examples. But when it comes to food choices, then there's just like changing lifestyles, and they try to avoid this. So what we like to see in there is really have this concrete examples or suggestions. Please reach meat reduction, maybe like having some research behind this, like.
Okay, but you're saying that meat and meat consumption is mentioned in the report, but it's in a very vague way that doesn't lead to any measurable actions. Okay. And do you think in general that this IPCC report is important? Like, do you think it's important that meat consumption is addressed in this, and how can that lead to a better international agreement mentioning meat in climate goals?
I mean, it's definitely really important to have meat consumption in there, because it is an important report, definitely, and it will get like a lot of attention. And it's like it fits perfect in the time in the October lead up to COP, between the Global Climate Action Summit and all this momentum in the media out there. And I mean, the IPCC reports are taken serious, definitely. And if there would be a strong paragraph in there about meat consumption or reduction of meat consumption, that would be great. But so far in the draft version, it's not in there. So I hope it will be in the final version, but I'm not sure if it will.
Yeah, and this is worrying because according to the estimates, even if we succeed with all of our attempts to limit emissions from transport or energy generation, by 2050, 80% of emissions will come from agriculture, because we didn't do any intervention there. And that's really shocking, because at the moment it's the low-hanging fruit. It's the one which has the simplest, least disruptive policy interventions. It's the one with the most rapid potential for results, as we saw from the beef and beans study. If it can reach 74% of the US, very heavy climate polluters, Paris climate targets, for 2020, then this means this is cheap and effective, and the cost of not acting is huge. So there's many reasons to focus on this, and it's disappointing if they talk about lifestyles, because lifestyles are a reflection of society and economy. So they should have policy suggestions. These are policies, these are best practices that other countries are doing to create an atmosphere where there is this choice, that just like if you want to buy an electric car now in many countries you can, because there are companies and policies that encourage that. If you want to buy an LED bulb instead of an incandescent bulb, you can go to the poorest villages in Africa or India and ask people who live on $2 a day. This is a incandescent bulb, the old one, 60 watts, and it lasts for 6 months, and it has this filament that's really sensitive, and it costs let's say it costs $1, and this is an LED bulb which lasts for years, and it consumes 5 watts instead, and it can't break, and it costs $1.50. Even the poorest people in the world know what the better product is, and everyone has switched to LED bulbs. This is because of smart policies that have encouraged this. Now, similarly, you can have that same sort of change with smart policies when it comes to food by giving people that choice. And most people are economically rational actors. They will choose the product that makes sense for them. So you have to make it accessible, make it affordable, make it attractive.
Okay, I think that's an uplifting speech I think we can end with. There's a couple more questions in the comments, which I'll address in writing, and I'll pass the questions through to our speakers as well. So I'd like to thank once again Ruchir, Daniel, and Nico from ProVeg International for this speech, and please follow up with any more questions. Thank you so much, and that was the end of this webinar. Goodbye.